Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the proper seam allowances, when and where to use which seam allowance, the ergonomics of sewing, and how to sew without pins. So let's get started. Okay, when you get a commercial pattern, generally the first instructions in the pattern is all seam allowances are set at 5/8 inch unless otherwise noted. And they're very seldom noted otherwise. So you sew everything with a 5/8 inch seam allowance thinking that that's the proper seam allowance for all applications. But in fact, it actually sets you up for failure in some cases. For example, when you're sewing a collar to a neckline, and I want to show you with a little demonstration here. So when you have a collar, your collar is straight and your neckline is curved. And you're going to sew this edge to this. And what happens when you have a 5/8 inch seam allowance? You have all this rippling. And that's why you feel you need a lot of pins. How am I going to get all that in there? So then you put in dozens of pins. And then chances are you've been taught to put the collar down and the neckline up and stitch it on the machine. But what happens is these little, no matter how many pins you put in, inevitably you get one or two little pin tucks, and then you have to go back, snap the thread, and stretch it out and try to get it back into place. When really, if your seam allowance was only 1/4 of an inch, the rippling would be taken down to almost nothing. Then what we teach you is you put the neckline against the feed dog, because the feed dog are easing. And I'm going to explain that in just a couple of minutes when I get to sewing without pins. But just take a minute to think about that, how many times you put in dozens and dozens of pins. And a beginning student, when we teach them to do it this way, can put the collar on first time, every time, no pins and no tucks. So that ought to whet your appetite right there. Okay. So I want to talk about seam allowances. Where would you use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance? Well, you would use it on the neckline because now it's going to take that rippling off. And also you would use it on the neckline because the second step in the pattern directions are going to be cut it down to 1/4 of an inch. Why is that? Because it's an enclosed seam. So I'm going to show you an example on this shirt right here. This is our City Western women's blouse shirt. And here we've done 3/8 inch seam allowances because we're going to double top stitch. Otherwise, we would have done 1/4 inch. The reason we do 3/8 here is because when we do that first row of top stitching, we have a really nice look. But if we didn't have the same depth of fabric to stitch through on our second row of top stitching, they would not look congruent. They would not look similar. And if it was slightly off, and sometimes you hit the thickness and sometimes you didn't, you'd lose your tension, your stitching would just look awful. And I think that's why so many people just shy away from any top stitching. So there's a really good rule to know that you've got to have that extra thickness to bite through when you're stitching. So any enclosed seam, so you know a cuff's going to be an enclosed seam, which means the seam is not visible on the inside of the garment. It's all enclosed. The same thing happens with a yoke, and obviously a collar, the seam is completely enclosed. And again, we would do that at 1/4 unless we were going to double top stitch, and then we'll just ease that out to a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So any enclosed seam is 1/4 of an inch. Any seam you're going to double top stitch, chances are you're going to want 3/8. Side seams generally are set at 5/8 unless you are trying to fit someone or you're not sure about the fit of this particular pattern. Oftentimes, seamstresses will leave that to a 1-inch seam allowance just so they have some wiggle room. You've probably seen that if you've purchased a bridesmaid's dress. They always leave those nice wide seam allowances so that it can be adjusted by the seamstress to that specific person. So 5/8 inch I'd also leave in a princess seam until I was sure of the fit. Now if you're making the garment for the second or third time, then you don't need to leave that. And it's just always much easier to stitch at a 1/4 or a 3/8 than it is a 5/8. Also, 5/8 inch seam allowances are mandatory for flat felled seams, French seams, and inserting zippers. So keep that in mind. But I think that's it on seam allowances. And the next thing I'm going to show you is ergonomics of sitting at your sewing machine. Now I want to tell you about the ergonomics of sewing and why it is so important. One of the first things I want to talk about is having your sewing machine level and having so that your arms are bent at a 90-degree angle. Instead of having your sewing machine up higher, say for instance setting it on your dining room table, and then you have to sew like this. In a very short amount of time, your shoulders get stiff and sore, you get a stiff neck, and sewing isn't as much fun as it could be if you had your machine at that level. So let's say that the dining room table is the only place you have to sew. Now, don't use the dining room chair. Go get an office chair. You can buy them inexpensively at one of the office stores that raises and lowers so that you can raise that chair up so that you're sitting like this. You'll be able to sew for hours longer if you take that little tip. The other thing is having a complete flat surface flush with your sewing machine. Again, as opposed to having it just sitting on top of a table. Once you have as much surface as possible around, like I have here, which is very large surface, I could make a full-length coat on this table because it would just slide around the table as I was working, as opposed to working up on the machine where the project starts to drag off the back of the machine, and then it makes it more difficult for you to get a nice straight seam. It just keeps fighting you the whole way. So having that flat surface doesn't have to be expensive either. This plexiglass that you see around this machine comes with little legs. So if I lived in a small apartment, I didn't have room to have a cabinet or a table, and I had to use my dining room table, I would get one of these plastic, they're called extension tables, and they can be purchased to fit any machine. They're not a generic cutout. They have to be cut exactly to fit your machine. But you'll see in the resource list places where you could go to get one of those. So in this case, when I came to Craftsy, they have this beautiful big table that I adore, but the opening is larger than my machine. So I want to have this flush surface across, so I took the legs off my extension table and got the machine and the extension table so they're nice and flush. Okay, so just another tip is you can go on the internet. There are lots of sources for cabinets and tables that range from $125 all the way to $8,000. So whatever your budget might be, you can purchase, or you could actually take a table and cut a hole out of it, put your machine down and do exactly what I did. Next, I'd like to tell you about two of my favorite options that are now available on most sewing machines. And the first one is a knee lift. Now, what I find is that people have these in the box of their machine and it's been sitting there for years because they didn't know what it was for. And actually what the knee lift does is it allows you to hands-free lift the presser foot without having to go back and do it manually. So here's what it looks like. So if you have one of these, get it out. It's going to be your best friend. It just pops into the front of the machine. And then it allows you to lift the foot without using your hands. So let me just show you quickly how efficient that is. So you're going to stitch along, and then you want to turn the corner. Normally you would stop, lift this up, turn the fabric, put it back down and go. But instead, all I have to do is push my knee, release, and turn. Now watch that again. Just lift and turn. So this is just another one of those efficiency options that I just don't want to ever live without. Now the next one is the automatic thread cutter. Now, I'm not talking about the little blade on the side where you chop the threads off when you're done with the seam. This is far better. It looks like a little pair of scissors on most brand sewing machines. And when you push that button, what it just did was it took the top thread, pulled it to the bottom, and cut them both off very small. Now I can just move on and put my next seam in and keep on sewing. So those two are my favorite options on a sewing machine. Look for those if you're in the market for a new machine, but please know, it doesn't matter what kind of a sewing machine you have, everything I'm going to teach you in this class can be done on any sewing machine, including a treadle. All right, let's learn about sewing without pins. And we don't sew without pins just to make it easier or faster. We sew without pins because it is more efficient, and you can accomplish actually better seams without using pins than you can using them in many, many cases. So just imagine you go into one of the high-end department stores, let's say it's Saks, Neiman, Nordstrom's. The garments hanging on the rack in those stores, with the exception of couture, have not been pinned. They've not been basted. But you'll see how beautifully they hang, and that's because the people in the garment factory have been taught to do it the most efficient way. Home sewers were taught by their grandmother, by their aunt, and it continually passed down from generation to generation. But actually, their technique started with hand sewing, because before the sewing machine was invented, everyone hand sewed their garments together. So when the home sewer started to get sewing machines in the home, she continued to sew the way she did with hand sewing, which was pin them all together. So this class is going to help you get rid of most of those pins. Now, I'm not going to say you'll never use a pin again, but you'll use them far less and you'll use less pins. So let's talk about why we think we need pins. And that's because if we took a 36-inch strip, 2 strips like I have right here, and you just put them in the machine, and I know many people have done this, they said, oh, I'm in a hurry, it's just a straight seam, I don't need pins, and they just put it through the machine and stitched it. Chances are what you found was that when you got to the end, even though they were the same length when you started, when you got to the end, the bottom layer was considerably shorter than the top. And you didn't know why. Oh, maybe I cut it wrong. So you just chopped off the extra. But what happened is that you had a little bit of easing going on that bottom layer. And it's never going to hang as nice as it would if it was stitched as it was cut and drafted to be the exact length. When you examine the sewing machine, you see that we have feed dog under here. And I want you to see, if you've never really understood what the feed dog are or you're new to sewing, this is what they are. And they're coming up and pulling the fabric away from you to take it through the machine so you can stitch it. But they're only in contact with the bottom layer. So they continue to ease even if you put pins every 6 inches. If you did not hold the fabric properly, you're still going to have some easing between those pins. So if you've ever pinned a long seam and stitched it and then all of a sudden found a little pin tuck here and there, that's why you found that pin tuck. Because even if you've got pins in there, it's still not avoiding that feed dog action. So I'm going to show you real soon how to avoid that feed dog action without pins. But first I want to talk about a couple of my favorite tools for sewing. And the first one is called an Optivisor. The Optivisor, you probably have seen, maybe your dentist used one similar to this. It may have had lights on it. You see jewelers use them a lot. And what they are is it just sits on top of your head. It's adjustable. And then you just pull this down in front of your eyes. And when you do, everything in the rest of the room goes completely out of focus. But whatever is 8 to 10 inches from your eye is magnified, just as if you were holding one of those old-fashioned magnifiers. So now, if I'm having trouble seeing stitching black on black, or it's late at night, or your eyes are starting to be weaker as you age, this is an excellent tool. And what's beautiful about it is you forget you even have it on, and you can just pull it down when you need it and pop it up when you don't. The second tool I want to talk about is these little nippers. And you'll see them, you can buy very inexpensive ones that are disposable, or you can buy a pair like these, which are chrome, and they can be resharpened just like a pair of scissors. So I think these are worth the investment. They're more expensive, obviously, than the disposables. The other thing I want to tell you is how to use it. You use it by just grabbing the end and pushing down. That's the efficiency of it. When I learned some of the industrial techniques when I was young, a teenager, and my aunt was teaching me these techniques, what they had learned then in the garment factory was every time an operator stopped to pick up a full pair of scissors and cut the threads every time, it added minutes, which ended up to be hours, which ends up to be dollars when you're doing it for a business. So what they did was they came along and they taught the women to pick the scissors up by the tips and just do this. And that's what I was taught to do. And then that's why this was invented, because it automatically has a spring in it. This hole is not for your thumb. You won't have anywhere near the right leverage if you put your thumb in there. I think it's just for maybe hanging it on a chatelaine or something. But really, don't try to use this for your thumb. Just grab the end and clip the threads just like that. Okay, so let's get started with sewing without pins. Now, I'm working with Kona cotton, which I think is a perfect weight fabric to start this learning to sew without pins. I'm going to put it under here and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But what you'll see is I'm sinking the needle a few stitches ahead of the raw edge. And the reason I'm doing that is twofold. One is that if I start on the edge and you have a machine that does a zigzag, you have a very large hole there in the throat plate. And what will happen is it'll suck that fabric right down in there. Everything gets knotted up, and sometimes it's impossible to get all the knots out of it. Or you rip the fabric trying to pull it back out of the bobbin case. So the other reason is that I want to lock this seam by going over it twice, but not 3 or 4 times. So if I start in the back and I come forward, then I've got to go back and come forward again. And what happens is you want to lock the seam, but you don't want too much thread in the area. And if you stitch back and forth too many times, what you actually do is create a stress point instead of alleviating a stress point. So we're going to back up first to the and come back forward. Always stop with the needle down. If you have that option on a machine, and it's another perfect option to look for if you're purchasing a new machine, is the ability to be able to just have the machine always stop with the needle down. When you're sewing without pins, that's really important, because I'm going to come back several times and readjust as I sew this seam. If my needle's down, it can't move. Otherwise, if the needle's up and I move, it can move ever so slightly, and now my seam has little hiccups in it as I'm going down. That will not press as flat and even as nice as you would like it to. So stop with the needle down. Then I'm going to come back. This is 2 strips, and I really suggest that you try this. So 2 strips about 3 inches wide, a firmly woven cotton, 36 inches long. If I'm in a garment factory, I'm going to start way back here, get these ends together. There are very few notches on pattern pieces in a garment factory, but you'll have notches. So you'll find your first notch. So let's say my first notch is right here. In garment factory, I'd still be hanging on to this. But as a new sewer to this method, I want you just to let that go. Now, your thumb under, fingers on top, tilt this at a 90-degree angle. Approximately a 90-degree angle toward the machine. Now that's going to keep that bottom layer from going through faster than the top layer. It's as simple as that, but only if you maintain that grip. Do not let the fabric slide between your fingers and thumb. Now your left hand is going to do 2 things. It's going to keep the 2 layers of fabric from sliding back and forth, because we want those raw edges to be completely flush. And it's also going to help us guide whatever seam allowance. So in this case, it's going to be a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to come back as far as I can. Again, a really good important reason for having a table surface. If I was sewing on one of those little beds, I'd only be able to sew from here to here, about 10 stitches at a time. And that would be laborsome, to say the least. So I can start way back here. The left hand comes down with the pads of your fingers down on the fabric and at this angle, not this angle, at this angle. And the pads of those fingers put a little bit of pressure on that fabric, which helps you guide it and helps keep that bottom layer from shifting. So now we just stitch right up to the needle. This left hand does not go back here. We do not pull the fabric through the machine. First of all, that's what the feed dog do. Secondly, you're losing your ergonomics again if you're constantly pulling forward. So now I just stop there with the needle down, come back, make sure everything's even, find my next notch, thumb under, fingers on top, tilted toward the machine. Let your left hand help you. Stop, readjust. And, you know, industrial sewing techniques will speed up your sewing, but it's not about going faster. It's about just being able to sew efficiently. You don't have to put the pins in, you don't have to take the pins out. You don't have to cut the seam down, allowance down, because you cut it that way when you cut out your garment. And you won't be picking out as many stitches because you'll understand the way the machine works and you won't be fighting it. So many times people just fight the machine and they don't know why. Your machine should not be an adversary. But by understanding the way that feed dogs are working, now you'll understand what's going wrong in specific cases of, as you're sewing along and it seems like the top layer is just too big and it's going to get tucks and bumps in it, chances are you've got the wrong piece against the feed dog. So understanding what the feed dog do help you put the right piece against a feed dog. So here's an important rule to remember. The longest, the slipperiest, the most biased, the most difficult to handle always goes against the feed dog. I don't think any pattern guide other than the ones that we've created at Islander Sewing Systems ever even address that issue. But in my pattern guides, I tell you every time, what piece do you put against the feed dog? So let's just, one more example would be, if you have a piece that's been interfaced and a piece that has not been interfaced, and you've got to sandwich those together and sew them together, you would put the non-interfaced piece against the feed dog because it's the loosest. The other one's been stabilized. So as you're sewing in your next projects, this will make a lot of sense, and you'll be sewing along and you'll have those problems and you'll say, oh, wait a minute, I know what I have to do. I just have to turn this over and sew it from the other side. So there we have it. That's sewing a straight seam, 36 inches long, and keeping everything together. Now, curves. Curves are, can be sewn very well without pins. Again, if you do need pins, go ahead and put 1 or 2 in as opposed to where you would have put in 12 or 15. But remember to hold the fabric the way I'm teaching you. That makes all the difference. Okay, so when you come to an inside curve, the biggest mistake most sewers make is they'll go to sew this. So let's just get started here with a 1/4 inch seam, and they'll get themselves locked, and now they're ready to go, and they'll do this. And then they'll sew their 1/4 inch seam allowance. What they have effectively done is misshapen their curve. It has to be stretched out of shape to be able to do that. And to get the very best look in your finished garment, something that when you get it done, you're proud to wear, then these little tips make all the difference. So what I want you to do is realize that you have to honor the curve. You can't straighten that curve out, just like you're driving your car on a curve. You've got to follow the curve. So same thing. So we just thumb under, fingers on top. I'm holding this layer together. I'm using my left hand to guide, and I just guide around that curve until I get to this outside curve. Now, what are we going to do with the outside curve? Okay, what we want to do is get through this curve smoothly and cleanly. what usually happens in home sewing methods is the operator gets partway through the curve and she really thinks she's going to make it. I think I'm going to make it this time, and all of a sudden she's going off course. So you stop with the needle down, you pick up the foot, you readjust, you sew a few more stitches, stop with the needle down, pick up the foot, and so on. Problem with that is that you're going to have hiccups in that curve because you had to stop. So what you want is the most fluid movement possible. And again, I'm sure you're going to see why I have this big table surface, because I can manipulate that curve and come out with a better looking one than if I had a small bed and I was using pins. Now the reason we're going to do this, I want you to see that I'm twisting my hand back, because as the machine goes, I'm going to be spinning as if I was just another set, like a wheel that works together. So here we go. So we come into this curve, and as we get into that curve, I'm just going to keep turning my hand and make it completely through that curve without having to stop. Just take a little practice. It doesn't take long. None of these techniques are something that takes years or weeks or even hours to learn. It just takes a few tries at it, and you'll get better each time, and you'll realize how comfortable and how second nature it really is now that you understand the feed dog and you understand having that flat surface and what a difference it can make. So that's the beginning of sewing without pins. We're going to do some more sewing without pins in another lesson. And in our next lesson, we're going to learn all about fusible interfacings. See you there.